For centuries, she's been depicted as everything from a noble queen to an unfaithful lover, a political pawn to a powerful woman who shaped a kingdom's destiny. But who actually was Guinevere? Was she a real historical figure or purely a product of myth? How has her story changed over time, and why does she still captivate us even today? Strap in. I almost said strap up there, but this is not that kind of podcast, so strap in, because we're about to unravel the tangled web of love, betrayal, and power that surrounds Queen Guinevere. Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore from all over the world and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I am so grateful to have you here with me today. If you're new to the podcast, welcome on in. I really hope you like it here, and if you do, please do consider subscribing or following wherever you're listening, and feel free to leave me a little comment or a review. It makes my day. And you can also follow me over on Blue Sky, where I would be very happy to chat with you. I love talking to you guys, and I'm so excited to talk to you even more when the Patreon opens up in April. And if you want full details on that and you've missed it, please check out the short announcement episode that I released a few days back. I really hope that some of you will join me there, and I have lots of stuff to come. And I'm also completely open to suggestions on that as well, so if there's anything you'd like to see me talk about over there, please let me know. Now let's talk about the subject of today's episode, Guinevere. Yes, today we are headed on back to the world of Arthurian legend, but this time we're diving deep into the life and legend of Queen Guinevere, one of the most exciting and well-known figures in Arthurian legend. We've touched on her a little bit in the episode on Morgan Le Fay, and that episode was so popular with you guys that I figured it was only right to give our girl Gwynnie an episode all to herself. In fact, she's getting 2 episodes all to herself because this is the first of a 2-parter, and it's the first 2-parter in general on Ladies of Lore. To be honest, I got a little bit lost in the sauce on this one, and I couldn't stop reading things and writing things, and my brain was full of stuff that I just wanted to tell you all. So yes, this is going to be a 2-parter. Today, we're going to focus on earlier tellings and stories of Guinevere, and next week we'll dive into how things changed through time and on modern day Guinevere. And I hope that's okay, and if 2-parters with a bit more detail in is something that you'd like more of, let me know. So, here goes. The origins of Queen Guinevere, the legendary queen consort of King Arthur, are deeply enmeshed in the complex web of Arthurian mythology and medieval romance literature. The character of Guinevere evolved over centuries, shaped by oral tradition, Celtic mythology, medieval chronicles, and the literary embellishments of later writers. Her story is a blend of myth, history, and romance, making it difficult to pinpoint a single definitive origin. However, by tracing the earliest references to her character and examining the evolution of her role in Arthurian legend, we can cobble together a pretty detailed understanding of her origins and her significance. The roots of Guinevere's character can be traced back to pre-Christian Celtic mythology, where she might have originated as a sovereignty goddess. In many Celtic traditions, the legitimacy of a king was often linked to his marriage to a goddess who personified the land. This archetype appears frequently in Irish and Welsh mythology, where goddesses such as Maeve and Rhiannon take on similar roles. So it is possible that Guinevere represents a Christianized adaptation of an older goddess figure who conferred kingship upon Arthur by her union with him. This was quite a common thing in medieval literature, with authors, particularly in the 12th century, reshaping earlier pagan myths to fit Christian ideals. For instance, there is this theme of adultery, and we'll speak more on that later, but that might stem from efforts to suppress her more autonomous divine attributes and instead align her more with female biblical characters. And not only this, there are even more parallels between Guinevere and Celtic goddesses. For instance, our girl Guinevere does have a little bit of a habit of getting kidnapped, in Welsh tradition by Melwas and then later by Mordred. And this is a bit of a recurring motif of Celtic goddesses. They're often courted by rival lovers or they're stolen, reflecting the struggle for kingship and divine favour. And you'll definitely be seeing some of these motifs in the stories of Guinevere I tell you later in the episode. And then, of course, there's also the issue of the love triangle. In Celtic mythology, sovereignty goddesses often had multiple consorts, reflecting shifts in political power. And let me tell you, you're about to hear about one of the most epic love triangles today. Her name itself also suggests an ancient origin. The Welsh form of Guinevere translates roughly to white phantom or white enchantress, indicating potentially some supernatural roots. The elements of her name, Gwen, meaning white or blessed, and Hwyfar, meaning phantom or smooth, are potentially connections to Celtic otherworldly beings rather than a purely historical figure. And this aligns with other aspects of early Arthurian lore, where characters frequently straddle the boundary between history and myth. Welsh traditions also provide some of the earliest references to Guinevere. She appears in Culhwch and Olwen, a late 11th century Welsh prose tale, where she's mentioned extremely briefly as Arthur's wife and as part of his list of possessions that he will never part with. How cute. And this work is part of the Mabinogion cycle. And the Mabinogion is a collection of medieval Welsh tales that blend mythology, folklore, history, and Arthurian legend. Composed in Middle Welsh and preserved in manuscripts such as the White Book and the Red Book, it includes the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, which revolve around themes of magic, transformation, and destiny, featuring figures like Rhiannon and Branwen, who are ladies of lore that maybe I might like to feature on future episodes, so let me know if that sounds of interest to you. And alongside these, the collection contains other tales, including Arthurian romances that parallel continental legends while retaining distinctly Welsh elements. And this makes the Mabinogion a vital source for understanding Welsh cultural heritage, and it's here, like I said, that we find a very brief mention of Guinevere. And although this does not develop her character significantly, it does indicate that she was already an established figure in Arthurian tradition before the more well-known tales. And I'd just like to say I apologise for any pronunciation of the Welsh words in this podcast. I have done some research and I have listened to how they're supposed to be pronounced. I've done my best, but please feel free to correct me. You can always correct me on my pronunciations. I do my best, but it's not always perfect. And here's a little side note for you. Guinevere also had a sister, often named Gwenhwyfach, or a variation of this name. She is a relatively obscure figure in Arthurian legend, but she appears in Welsh tradition and in some later medieval sources. The details of her character, her role, and significance vary depending on the text, and in some variations of the legend, she's portrayed as a rival to Guinevere rather than an ally. In Welsh tradition, particularly in the triads of the island of Britain, which is Welsh medieval folklore, she's explicitly mentioned as Guinevere's sister, and one of the triads refers to a violent quarrel between the two sisters as one of the 3 harmful blows that led to the Battle of Camelot, which is the final conflict in which King Arthur meets his doom. The exact nature of this quarrel is never fully explained, but its inclusion in the triads suggests that it was a well-known element of the older Arthurian tradition. And some scholars speculate that their dispute might have been over inheritance, or possibly marriage, or even just personal enmity, though later retellings of Arthurian legend don't really elaborate on this. The Vulgate cycle and other French romances don't really place much emphasis on Guinevere's family, and her sister doesn't really play a significant role in these narratives. However, in some later medieval versions of the legend, her role is expanded, and it sometimes aligns her with Mordred's rebellion against Arthur, and in these accounts she's either complicit or indifferent to the downfall of Camelot, standing in contrast to Guinevere, whose tragic love for Lancelot contributes to the kingdom's collapse, but is never portrayed as outright treasonous. And although Gwenhwyfach is not a well-developed character like Guinevere is, her presence in the triad hints at a bit of a lost tradition in which she might have played a more significant role in the downfall of Arthur's reign. And if you're interested in reading more about her, the Triads of the Island of Britain are the best source, and there are plenty of editions with translations available to have a little peruse through if you fancy it, but there's a little side note about a lesser-known Lady of Lore for you today. I'm spoiling you. But back to Guinevere now, and on to her very first significant appearance, which came in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae of about 1136. And I read a really fascinating chapter in a book by Fiona Tolhurst all about how Geoffrey discusses women in general across all of his works. So before we see what he had to say about Guinevere, here's a quote from that chapter that I found to be really poignant. The varied, complex and predominantly positive images of women Geoffrey creates in all three of his extant works distinguish him from most male authors of the Middle Ages, and support the claim that he is a feminist for his time if the reader defines feminist in a period-specific sense. His works depart from and implicitly reject the anti-feminist tradition of the Middle Ages. So there we go, maybe a touch of early feminism, at least for the time. And in Historia Regum Britanniae, which is kind of a pseudo-historical account of Britain's legendary past, Guinevere, here called Guanhumara, is a noble woman of Roman descent, a woman of great beauty and noble lineage, and Monmouth actually says that she surpassed the women of the island with respect to beauty. And while Geoffrey only provides a very brief mention of her, he does introduce a crucial narrative thread that would define much of her later literary character, her betrayal of Arthur. But even this can be interpreted in a few different ways, especially now we know that Monmouth might be a little bit more favourable in his representations of female characters. And Guanhumara's role in Arthur's downfall is a bit of a tricky one. She ends up with Mordred, Arthur's nephew, and the man who seizes the throne while Arthur is off fighting in Rome. But something that's really interesting here is that Geoffrey doesn't actually say that she chooses Mordred. Instead, he uses a passive phrase to describe her situation. She has been joined to Mordred in what he calls abominable sexual relations. Now, why is that phrasing a little bit thought-provoking? Well, because on one hand, the traditional reading paints her as a willing participant, the unfaithful queen whose betrayal helps to bring about Arthur's tragic end. And this is the idea that influenced later medieval writers, and we'll talk about that soon. But there is another way to read this, because if we focus on Geoffrey's choice of words, it almost suggests that Guanhumara didn't really have much of a choice at all. If Mordred had just staged a coup, raised a massive army, and declared himself king, could he have forced her into this relationship? Geoffrey certainly makes Mordred the real villain here, calling him a tyrant and a traitor who usurped Arthur's throne. So, was Guanhumara an active betrayer, or was she just a queen caught in a power struggle that she could not escape? Geoffrey leaves just enough ambiguity to let us wonder. Arthur's response to this betrayal is one of rage and a desire for vengeance. He gathers his forces to reclaim his throne, culminating in the Battle of Camelot. And while Geoffrey does not elaborate on Guinevere's fate after Mordred's defeat, later medieval texts drawing from Historia expand on her story, portraying her as penitent and seeking redemption in a convent. Whichever way you look at it though, Geoffrey Monmouth's account of Guinevere in Historia Regum Britanniae sets the foundation for her later literary evolution, and in the following decades, as the Arthurian legend spread across Europe, Guinevere's character became more developed and nuanced. And we see this with the Norman French writer Wace, and in his Roman de Brut of 1155, he largely follows Geoffrey Monmouth's account, but he does expand it somewhat, offering a more detailed and sometimes more emotionally complex version of the Arthurian legend. Here, Guinevere retains her noble Roman origins, but she's given slightly more depth. Much like previous iterations, Wace describes her as a lady of great beauty, of noble lineage. And he further adds nuance to her actions and even suggests a degree of personal agency. Guinevere's betrayal of Arthur with Mordred is still central to the downfall of the kingdom, but instead of simply stating that she became Mordred's wife, Wace provides a more layered account, describing how Mordred seizes the throne and takes Guinevere for himself. Now, I want to read this to you in the original language, so please forgive me for the pronunciation of this. I just couldn't pronounce pronunciation then, so this is not looking good for me. Mordred prist la reine, si la tint a femme, which translates to Mordred took the queen and held her as his wife. The use of the word prist means took, and the word tint, which means held, leaves open the possibility that Guinevere did not willingly conspire with Mordred, but was rather forced into her new role. A little similar to what Geoffrey of Monmouth could also have implied, but probably a little bit more explicit. And there's also another little tidbit in this telling of the story that doesn't feature in others, and that is Guinevere's inability to have children with Arthur is mentioned very early on, and some scholars actually suggest that this may have been, in part, a reason for her infidelity with Mordred. So again, there are so many different ways to look at this and to interpret it, and I just find it so interesting, guys. That's why this is being split into 2 episodes. But one of the key differences in Wace's narrative is that he provides a more explicit fate for Guinevere. Unlike Geoffrey of Monmouth, who does not elaborate on her end, Wace tells us that upon Arthur's return, she flees to a convent, seeking atonement. And he says that she entered a monastery and never left it for the rest of her life. And this detail marks a shift towards the later medieval tradition of Guinevere's repentance, paving the way for the portrayals of her as a tragic figure in later Arthurian romances. And with these works came perhaps the most significant transformation in Guinevere's character, the introduction of the Lancelot-Guinevere love affair, which was popularised by the 12th century French poet Chrétien de Troyes. In his romance, Lancelot, or the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien crafted a sophisticated narrative centred on the ideas of fin amour, or courtly love. In Lancelot ou le Chevalier, Chrétien presents Guinevere in a radically different light compared to Historia Regum Britanniae and Roman de Brute. Rather than being just a passive figure or mere political agent in Arthur's downfall, she becomes the centre of a passionate, illicit romance with Lancelot, which defines both of their characters and drives the narrative forward. And when we look at the context within which he was writing, it sort of makes sense that Guinevere is a bit more of an active character. De Troyes was writing for the court of Marie de Champagne, a court where women played important roles, so it would be more realistic for Guinevere to fulfill a similar role to the audience. So it makes sense that Chrétien describes Guinevere as an object of devotion, embodying the ideals of courtly love. And Lancelot's unwavering loyalty to her is demonstrated early on in the story when he suffers humiliation by riding in a cart simply to reach her. And you might be thinking, well, what else is he going to ride in? But traditionally, carts were used to transport criminals. And de Troyes emphasises how Lancelot hesitates for a brief moment before stepping into the cart. It goes like this: "Yet reason that's divorced from love warned him from making such a move, counselling him thus to refrain, telling him all things to disdain that presage reproach and shame. Reason then must share the blame, reaching the lips, but not the heart. So reason counselled for its part, yet love, enclosed within the heart, urged him to mount aboard the cart. That he did, since love wished it so, careless of what shame might follow." Now, you might think that Guinevere would probably be a bit grateful that Lancelot risked shame and followed love when he climbed into the cart. But when they reunite, she initially withholds her affection, her anger stemming from his hesitation, showing that in this version of her character, love demands an absolute and unquestionable devotion. Unlike Geoffrey of Monmouth's portrayal, in which Guinevere's defining act is her betrayal of Arthur with Mordred, de Troyes presents her as a woman with agency, who dictates the rules of her love. And after she gets over her annoyance with him, she ultimately rewards Lancelot's suffering and devotion by granting him the gift of her love. And false news of his death sort of helps her to forgive him too, because the poem describes her as almost dying at the table when she hears news that he is dead. And then it goes on to show this deep internal conflict within her, where she deeply regrets the way that she treated him. Let's have a little look at how that bit goes. "Alas, what was I thinking of when before me stood my love, that I disdained to greet him there, and would not hear his words so fair?" And she even sort of tries to pull the whole "I was only joking" sort of thing. And she says, "As a jest I intended it, but no jest. He did not think it so, for indeed he pardoned me not. None but myself killed Lancelot." Now, thankfully, it transpires that the news of Lancelot's death isn't true, and after another fake death rumour, this time of Guinevere's, they are able to rekindle their love upon his return. And both parts of the poem where they grieve for each other is definitely worth a read, and I'll include links in the show notes to those. So when Lancelot returns, Guinevere forgives him for hesitating to get into the cart, and they arrange a little late-night rendezvous. He does quite a lot, actually, to get into her bedchambers here. He literally bends iron bars from the window and he cuts his finger almost clean off, but he pays no mind to the blood or the pain because he's finally going to get to be with his love. In this way, their affair is not really condemned outright in the text, rather it's romanticised, and it's presented as the highest form of love, transcending even marriage. And when they consummate their love in her chamber, the scene is filled with idealised passion, with de Troyes going as far as to say, "It's a joy so marvellous that never was its equal delivered ever, or has ever been known or heard." Pretty romantic stuff. Again, I really would encourage you to read this if you can. Like I said, links will be in the show notes. It's really worth a read. Furthermore, Guinevere is not merely a damsel in distress waiting round to be rescued. Though she is abducted by Meleagant, she is far from helpless and she maintains her dignity and refuses to show distress. Even in captivity, she still holds power over Lancelot, testing his devotion and ensuring that their love adheres to the demanding expectations of courtly love. Chrétien's Lancelot therefore redefines Guinevere from a politically significant but morally ambiguous queen to the ultimate object of chivalric love. Unlike the previous retellings we've discussed where she's either the betrayer or a repentant figure, here she is an active participant in a love affair that is presented as both dangerous and noble. This shift reflects the evolving medieval ideas of romance, where personal desire and knightly devotion begin to outweigh the rigid structures of marriage and duty. In Chrétien's version, Guinevere is not merely Arthur's queen, but she's an object of intense, passionate love for the noble knight Lancelot. Their affair becomes one of the defining elements of Arthurian romance, portraying Guinevere as a woman torn between duty and desire. She is elevated to the status of courtly lady, embodying the refined and often unattainable love that was central to medieval chivalric literature. Unlike earlier portrayals where she is a more passive figure or a traitor, Chrétien's Guinevere is a complex character who both inspires and tests Lancelot's devotion. And then we come to what is perhaps the most well-known version of Guinevere, and that is the Vulgate cycle. Written in around 1215 to 1235 by multiple authors, the Vulgate cycle gives Guinevere's character a significant expansion, blending elements from earlier portrayals while deepening her role in Arthurian tragedy. The Vulgate cycle develops the love affair between Guinevere and Lancelot much more than Chrétien de Troyes. Here, their relationship is not just a test of chivalric devotion, but it's a consuming force that gradually leads to the fall of Camelot. Guinevere is depicted as deeply in love with Lancelot, but also as a queen with responsibilities, torn between personal passion and her duty to Arthur. The narrative describes how she initially resists Lancelot's advances, but once their love is established, it becomes the defining element of both of their lives. Unlike in Chrétien's romance, where the affair is presented as courtly and almost divine, the Vulgate cycle treats it as more of a tragic sin, one that contributes directly to the destruction of Arthur's kingdom. One of the most famous episodes in the Vulgate cycle is Guinevere's condemnation and near execution when her affair with Lancelot is exposed. The text describes how she is accused of adultery and sentenced to be burned at the stake. However, Lancelot rescues her in dramatic fashion, leading to a violent conflict with Arthur's knights and deepening the fractures within the kingdom. The Vulgate cycle also departs from earlier portrayals in its treatment of Guinevere's ultimate fate. While Geoffrey of Monmouth and Wace left her story vague or ended with her taking religious vows, here she plays a bit more of an active role in her repentance. After Arthur's death, she retreats to a convent, where she devotes herself to penance, and she refuses to see Lancelot again, despite his desperate pleas, and dies in sanctity, marking a stark contrast to her earlier passionate self. The text describes her remorse, and the queen wept greatly and humbled herself before God. So, the Vulgate cycle transforms Guinevere into a tragic heroine. Unlike in Historia Regum Britanniae, where she is merely an agent of portrayal, or in Lancelot au Le Chevalier, where she is an object of idealised devotion, here she is a fully realised character. She's passionate and flawed, and ultimately seeking redemption. Her love for Lancelot is both the greatest romance of the Arthurian world and the catalyst for its destruction, making her one of the most complex figures in medieval literature. The Vulgate cycle presents Guinevere as both a noble and flawed character. She's deeply, deeply in love with Lancelot, but her affair becomes source of guilt and turmoil within her. And trust me, we are far from done with the changes in Guinevere's character. There is so much more to come, but now we've arrived at the Vulgate cycle, I think it's actually a great time to tell you some of these stories. So let's do that, shall we? I would hazard a guess that after the previous segment you have picked up on the fact that there are many versions of the stories of Guinevere, and more than I could mention today. And while I'd love to tell you them all, we just don't have time. So what I'm going to do is pick my favourite parts and hope that you enjoy them as much as I do. As always though, I'd really encourage you to have a look through the show notes where I will leave plenty of links to a variety of versions of the tales of Guinevere. That's your homework. Go and read some stuff. I'm not going to check that you did it though, I'm just going to trust you, okay? We're doing it on trust. Firstly, I'm going to tell you the story of the love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere and Lancelot, as told in the Vulgate cycle, also known as the Lancelot Grail cycle. And here, the story of Queen Guinevere and King Arthur's marriage unfolds as part of a vast interconnected narrative of chivalry, betrayal and destiny. I don't know if there are many Monty Python fans among you, but I'm struggling to picture Sir Lancelot as anyone other than John Cleese. So please know that that is the image in my head while I read you these stories, and I also picture them all riding invisible horses with coconut sound effects. If you've not seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, that is going to be the absolute weirdest sounding reference, but also, why haven't you seen it? Go and watch it, that's some more homework for you. But here goes. Arthur, having ascended to the throne and establishing his rule over Britain, seeks to strengthen his reign through a politically advantageous marriage. He chooses Guinevere, the daughter of King Leodegrance, not only for her beauty and noble lineage, but also because her father possesses the Round Table, a gift from Uther Pendragon that will become the foundation of Arthur's chivalric order. Upon their union, Leodegrance bestows the Round Table upon Arthur as part of Guinevere's dowry, symbolising the unity and ideals of his court. Despite the grandeur of their wedding and the promise of a strong and noble partnership, their marriage is doomed from the beginning. The Vulgate cycle suggests that Guinevere, though loyal in spirit to Arthur, is ultimately drawn into a tragic love affair with Lancelot, the greatest of Arthur's knights. This affair, which takes root when Lancelot first lays eyes on Guinevere, is foreshadowed by the supernatural elements and courtly prophecies. Merlin himself warns Arthur that Guinevere will be unfaithful. But Arthur, either out of love or political necessity, still chooses to proceed with the marriage. Guinevere's relationship with Lancelot is not immediate, but it develops over time. Lancelot, devoted to Arthur and bound by chivalric ideas of loyalty and service, initially struggles against his growing love for the Queen. Their relationship is marked by moments of longing, restraint, and inevitable surrender to passion. Guinevere, though married to Arthur, finds in Lancelot a knight who represents the pinnacle of courtly love, one who would sacrifice everything for her. In particular, the Lancelot and prose section of the Vulgate cycle provides a deeply detailed account of Lancelot and Guinevere's secret meetings, portraying their love as both passionate and tragic. Their affair unfolds through a series of clandestine encounters, marked by intense devotion, peril, and ultimately betrayal. Lancelot is utterly devoted to Guinevere, seeing her as the centre of his existence. He risks everything, his honour, his knighthood, and his loyalty to Arthur to be with her. He frequently visits Guinevere in secret, often entering her chambers at night, and these moments are filled with both joy and foreboding, as they are both acutely aware of the dangers that surround them. And one passage describes Lancelot's longing and the risks he takes to see Guinevere. But so much did the Queen have in his heart that he ceased at nothing to come see his lady at night. And as soon as he had seen her, he would return to his lodgings with such great difficulty that never had a man led such a hard life as he did. And this passage highlights Lancelot's deep emotional turmoil. His love for Guinevere is both his greatest joy and his greatest suffering. He lives for the moments he can see her, yet he is tormented by the secrecy and the consequences of their love. Another scene details how Lancelot in disguise manages to sneak into Guinevere's chamber. And they took him and they led him into the Queen's chamber, where she received him most beautifully and made him great celebration. These encounters are often described just like that, with an air of enchantment, as if fate itself conspires to bring them together. However, their love is constantly under threat, and the Vulgate cycle foreshadows their eventual downfall. And there's a moment where Guinevere, aware of the suspicion surrounding them, warns Lancelot of the danger, and she says, "My sweet dear friend, know that we have been too reckless, and I fear that we shall suffer great disgrace and shame for it." And it's important to note here that even though they shared great passionate moments, Guinevere isn't always very nice to Lancelot, for although she deeply loves him, she is often possessive and quick to anger, sometimes punishing Lancelot for perceived slights. At the height of her love, Lancelot remains wholly devoted for the Queen, but his closeness to her has stirred resentment among Arthur's court. Many knights, particularly Agravain and Mordred, seek to expose their affair, but others simply wish to see Lancelot disgraced. Seizing an opportunity, a group of courtiers fabricates a tale that Lancelot has taken another lover, claiming that he has betrayed the Queen's trust. This rumour is insidious and persistent, and it reaches Guinevere's ears. And instead of questioning Lancelot, she allows her anger and her jealousy to consume her. When Lancelot arrives at court, unaware of the accusations, Guinevere greets him not with love, but with icy disdain. "False knight," she declares, "thou hast deceived me, and never more shall I look upon thee with favour." Lancelot is pretty stunned, and he pleads with her. He swears he's innocent. He assures her that no other woman has ever held his heart, and his devotion has never wavered. But Guinevere is blinded by jealousy and pride, and she refuses to listen. "Thou art forsworn," she tells him, "and I will have thee gone from my sight." Despite his protests, she does not relent, and in her rage she orders him to leave Camelot. Heartbroken and confused, Lancelot has no choice but to obey, and the great knight wanders the land in sorrow, stripped of his purpose. He takes refuge in desolate forests, living as a hermit for a time, consumed by grief over the Queen's unjust accusations. And meanwhile, Camelot suffers in his absence. The Round Table was once held together by Lancelot's strength and Arthur's wisdom, and it begins to fracture. Rivalries and jealousies fester amongst the knights, and those who had long resented Lancelot's influence over the Queen grow bolder. Yet fate is not done with Lancelot and Guinevere. When Arthur prepares to host a grand tournament, Guinevere, despite her lingering anger, she can't help but think of Lancelot, and she sends word that he might return to court. But Lancelot is still wounded by her rejection, and he refuses. However, he can't ignore a tournament. It's too tempting. So, disguising himself in unknown arms, he enters the lists as an anonymous knight. And as expected, he proves victorious and defeats all challengers. When Guinevere realises who he is, despite having missed him, she's not quite ready to forgive him. And instead of recognising his triumph, she uses it as another excuse for her jealousy, and she accuses him of not fighting for her, but to favour another lady. Enraged, she forbids him from appearing before her, once again banishing him from court. The second exile is even crueler and deepens the wounds of their love. Lancelot, humiliated and furious, leaves again, swearing to stay away. Yet the Queen's love for him does not fade, and soon enough she comes to regret her harsh words. The lovers are eventually reconciled, but their union is brief and fraught with danger. Their secret meetings, while moments of happiness, ultimately become the cause of Camelot's destruction. By this point in the story, Guinevere and Lancelot's love affair, though long suspected, remains unproven, and many at Arthur's court, particularly the Orkney clan of Agravain, Mordred and their brothers, still harbour this deep resentment towards Lancelot, either out of jealousy, ambition or personal grievance. Agravain in particular becomes obsessed with exposing the affair, seeing it as both a betrayal of Arthur and an opportunity to disgrace Lancelot. Arthur, though reluctant to believe the rumours, is eventually persuaded by Agravain and Mordred that Lancelot must be caught in the act. Arthur agrees to set a trap, though he does so with sorrow rather than eagerness, as he still holds Lancelot in great esteem. He leaves the court on a hunting trip, pretending to be absent, while Agravain and Mordred, along with 12 knights loyal to them, prepare to ambush Lancelot in Guinevere's chambers. That night, Guinevere and Lancelot meet in secret. A lady-in-waiting warns them of the plot, but they dismiss the danger, believing their love to be as safe as it always has been. However, Lancelot enters the Queen's chamber, and Agravain and his men, who have been waiting in the shadows, spring their trap. They surround the chamber and bar the doors, calling out accusations of treason and demanding that Lancelot surrender himself. Lancelot, unarmed and trapped, acts swiftly. He kills a guard and seizes his sword, fighting his way through Agravain's men with astonishing ferocity. He slays many of them, including Agravain himself, and forces the others to flee. Mordred, however, manages to escape and carries the news to Arthur. And the consequences are immediate and devastating. With undeniable proof of Guinevere's betrayal, Arthur has no choice but to act. He condemns Guinevere to death by burning at the stake, as the law demands for an adulterous queen. Lancelot is unable to abandon her, and he returns with his loyal followers to rescue her from execution. And although he succeeds, she refuses to go with him, and instead returns to Arthur. Which, if you ask me, is a little bit rude, to be honest. She's been quite rude to him, a lot, I will say. But Lancelot's act of defiance ignites a civil war within Arthur's kingdom, leading to the eventual downfall of Camelot. The betrayal shatters Arthur's rule, setting the stage for Mordred's rebellion and the final tragic battle at Camlan. And it's at Camlan that Arthur's rule comes to an end when he is mortally wounded by Mordred. And what of our girl Guinevere and her Sir Lancelot? Well, in the twilight of King Arthur's reign, after the Battle of Camlan had shattered the kingdom, Guinevere fled to the cloistered halls of Amesbury Abbey. There, beneath the shadow of stone and solemn prayers, she cast aside the wealth and splendour of her former life, donning the simple habit of a nun. She spent her days in fasting and penitence, her mind burdened with the ruins she had wrought. "Never shall I look upon Sir Lancelot again," she vowed, "for in my love I have betrayed the king, and through my betrayal the Round Table has fallen." Far from the world of courtly splendour, Lancelot wandered the lands, his heart hollow with grief. He had once been the most noble of knights, the greatest warrior of Arthur's fellowship, but now he was a man undone, stripped of purpose. When news reached him that the Queen had taken the veil, he knew his path was set. With 6 of his most loyal kin, he sought hermitage near the abbey, where he too renounced the world. Clad in rough cloth, he devoted himself to prayer, his soul aching for absolution. For years they lived this way, Guinevere behind convent walls, Lancelot in solitude and fasting. Yet even in their separation, their hearts remained bound by sorrow and longing. One night, in a vision, Lancelot saw an angel who warned him, "Arise, Sir Lancelot, for the queen whom thou hast loved is dead. Make haste if thou wouldst see her once more." He set forth at dawn with his brethren. When he reached Amesbury, the bell had already tolled. Guinevere lay lifeless upon her bier, her face serene, as if she had found peace at last. Lancelot knelt beside her, his fingers brushing the cold hand he had once cherished. "Alas, my lady," he whispered, "now thou art gone before me, but I shall not be long behind." With great sorrow, he and his company bore her body to Glastonbury, where they laid her to rest beside Arthur. But Lancelot could not remain. The world held nothing for him now. Returning to his hermitage, he fell into deep penance, neither eating nor speaking, his strength withering until one night, as he prayed at his altar, he saw another vision of angels. "It is time," they seemed to say, and a great peace settled upon him. When his brethren found him at dawn, he was still, his hands clasped in a final prayer. And so they bore him to rest at Joyous Gard, his home of old, where the greatest knight of the Round Table was laid in the quiet earth. The tale of Guinevere, Arthur and Lancelot, as told in the Vulgate cycle, is not simply a tale of romance and infidelity. It's a reflection of the tensions within the ideals of chivalry, the fragility of even the most noble of kingships, and the inescapable fate that befalls those caught between duty and desire. The narrative does not depict Guinevere as a simple adulteress, but rather as a woman torn between her obligations as queen and her love for Lancelot. Likewise, Arthur is not portrayed as an unworthy husband, but as a ruler whose commitment to justice and honour make him vulnerable to personal tragedy. This version of the story profoundly shaped later Arthurian retellings, influencing medieval and Renaissance literature and leaving an enduring mark on the legend of King Arthur. And I think that's about all we have time for on today's episode. Next week, we'll be taking a deeper look at what came after the Vulgate cycle and how Guinevere was portrayed in later retellings. And we'll also explore why the popularity of these Arthurian tales declined for quite a long time, and what brought them back to the forefront of British imaginations in the Victorian period. And we'll also chat about Guinevere in modern day media. It does involve Keira Knightley in a costume I can only describe as a weird choice for someone who's going into battle, but we'll talk all about that next week. Thank you so very much for joining me on today's episode of Ladies of Law. I really hope you've enjoyed it and that I've got you a bit excited to hear more about Guinevere on the next one. As I said earlier, if you have enjoyed the episode, please do follow, subscribe, wherever you're listening to the podcast right now. Feel free to leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you'd like to hear about. You can follow me over on Blue Sky. I do also have a TikTok now. I do. I've made a few. I'm not very good at it yet. But you can follow me over there, and all of the links to everything will be in the show notes, along with a ton of amazing sources which show you everywhere that I got my information from for this episode. And there's actually some really good stuff in there, guys. So please do have a little read. I think that's about all I have to say. It's a bit weird leaving you halfway through, but hey ho, we're going to do it. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're looking forward to the next week's episode as much as I am. So I guess that leaves me with one thing left to say, which is I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.